So hello, welcome. And today we'll have this also a very important panel on red lines. And again, without any further ado and very long introductions from my side, I will ask the participants to provide their introductory remarks for 5-7 minutes. How do you see today's international sphere? How you see those red lines? Are they there? Are we abiding by them, or are we afraid? How do you see the escalation management process that has been happening throughout the war and even before, long before that? So maybe we can start with Tomas, please.
Yeah, thank you, Adam. Thank you for your question. And I'm very glad to sit here with other experts on this hybrid warfare, political tension among West and Russia. And starting with my very first ideas, my very first thesis, I would say that I believe the most dangerous red lines are in our mindset. First of all, it's all about us. What kind of red lines we are setting in our mindset. And the most critical one is about the fear to see Russia defeated, both in political and military sense. And this kind of red line is so deeply entrenched in our, by saying our, I mean Western society, Western politicians and experts. This red line and this fear about Russia is so deeply entrenched in our minds that we are not ready to even imagine the destruction of Putin's regime, and we don't believe in our abilities to destroy Putin's regime and assets of its regime. I think that the rhetoric and some demands which are coming from Russia, they are just a kind of extension of our red lines. And we can say that, of course, Russia is very good at finding weak spots in our psychology. They are very good at exploiting our vulnerabilities and psychological sense of, first of all. And they are trying to intimidate our societies, of course, with our risk of escalation, with apocalyptic scenarios about nuclear war. And this intimidation forces our decision makers to extend our red lines into such a very specific decisions, like restricting Ukraine to use weapons deep inside Russian territory, or to restrict Ukrainians from receiving some specific weapons from West. And of course, I think that maybe the very first thing for us to deal with is just to redraw these red lines, just to imagine that Russia can be defeated. Because if you are not ready to see, to imagine, to visualize the defeat of your adversary, you cannot win any war. And of course, we can say that this manipulation which comes from Russian side about risk of nuclear war, it's one of the major reasons why a large part of Western society doesn't believe that you can win over Russia because it's a nuclear power. But nuclear scenario, I guess it's, I believe that nuclear scenario is a very distant one. We have many ways to weaken Russia in political, technological, economic ways. All what we need is more courage to use all those instruments available to us, starting from all those economic sanctions, exemptions which are just allowing to have for Western companies. So, and just starting from this imagination that you can use any available instrument to weaken Russia without triggering the nuclear war, I think that's a way how we can push away this kind of red lines. And speaking even about the possibility of ceasefire in Ukraine, I think that we should not focus on what kind of red lines we should induce to Russia. It is quite simple. Of course, everybody believes that the main task would be to deter Russia from using military or non-kinetic attacks on Ukraine again. But even more important is to decide what consequences we can impose on Russia if they are just starting the war again. What kind of damage we are ready to induce over them? Are we ready to retaliate, even to retaliate in a military sense? That's the question for us, first of all.
We'll talk about the retaliation soon enough. Yulia, what is on your mind?
Yeah, so coming from a genuine nuclear angle, I hear what you're saying. I wouldn't disagree with all the points you made, but I think that's the beauty of having such a panel to discuss these topics. I'm more concerned about the nuclear angle of the situation, but when you gave me these questions, I thought, well, maybe I can start with a bit more theoretical points of view. Sometimes they sound a bit boring, but I think they don't get as much attention in the public debate as they should be. So from the question, is this a real or a rhetorical boundary that Russia is setting, and whether we should take this credible? So when we look at deterrence from a theoretical point of view, then what we see right now is like a very core aspect of nuclear deterrence, which always leaves something to chance. Even when you have two perfect, rational, absolutely responsible actors, which Russia is not, but even if you have this ideal scenario, then nuclear deterrence always leaves something to chance. So you never have these absolute yes or no, this absolute certainty that nothing is going to happen. And I will also say why. You always have a certain level of ambiguity. This is not specific about Russia, it's specific for all nuclear weapon states. The UK, for example, have just reiterated in their last strategic document that they will never tell an adversary when, under which circumstances, and how they would use nuclear weapons. Same goes for France. They have this very opaque concept of all azimuth, 360-degree approach. Inter vito, what is vital interest for them, we don't know. What is the nuclear angle of the force de frappe, we don't know. So there's always this angle of ambiguity. This is not specific to Russia. Practically what Russia does, and what they did in the latest update to their nuclear doctrine, is playing with this ambiguity. So they changed the notion that they did in the 2020 basic principles that a threat to the survival of the state could lead to a nuclear attack, to something like a threat to the territorial integrity and the sovereignty of the state could trigger a nuclear attack, which is even more opaque. And they introduced this very concerning notion that if a nuclear weapon state supports a non-nuclear weapon state carrying out an attack against Russia, it could also be subject to nuclear deterrence. So this ambiguity itself is not something very specific to Russia, but we have to look at the context, of course. So the context in which Russia conducts its nuclear deterrence is a context of hybrid threats against multiple European states, against the Baltic states, also against Germany, basically against everyone in Europe on different levels, whether it's like influencing society, whether it's trying to influence expert circles, whether it's something more visible like disinformation. At the same time, they combine their traditional nuclear threats or traditional nuclear deterrence with all these gray zone nuclear labeled threats, including the seizure of the power plant in Zaporizhzhia, including playing with rhetoric around Ukraine could be using a dirty nuclear bomb, combined with the production of new missiles. So they create kind of a nuclear fog of war that leaves us very puzzled, very confused. All these threats happen on different levels. Sometimes you have very strange statements by people that are not necessarily in the front line, Medvedev or Karaganov or these Russian bloggers. So all this feeds into what I would frame as nuclear brinkmanship. It's not on this level, not traditional deterrence. But this ambiguity alone, these doctrines alone, are not very specific to Russia. What Russia does in a very Russia-specific way is signaling in a very peculiar manner. So we don't see this with NATO, UK, or US. They're framing their deterrence in a completely different way without adding these hybrid threats. And of course, it's not taking place in the context of a war against a non-nuclear neighbor, a war of aggression. So very quickly on the question whether this is credible, because it's very easy to assume this might all be a bluff and there's nothing behind it. I think it's very dangerous to assume that a nuclear threat coming from an actor like Russia, which is actually not rational, is not credible. Even when we assume that there is no intention to actually launch a nuclear strike, whether it would be against a European state, whether it would be in some remote region in Ukraine just to signal they're ready to do that, even if there's no intention to do that, there's always a possibility that something goes wrong, that there is an inadvertent escalation, there is an unintended, something related to miscommunication, miscalculation. It might seem very distant, but we had situations in the Cold War where there was a lot of miscommunication during the Cuban Missile Crisis. I know everyone is rolling the eyes when you bring up something like the Cuban Missile Crisis, but we do see that there were risks that could apply today as well. And these risks were just removed or solved in a way because we had channels of communications that were still working. There was a willingness on the Soviet side as well as on the American side to work on risk reduction measures. We don't see this willingness right now, and that's the huge problem. And even more so, I think we need to take these risks seriously. That doesn't mean we should be paralyzed. I'm also very critical about the German debate and how slow the weapons delivery to Ukraine went. But at the same time, we need to be very realistic that at least these risks are there and that we need to re-establish nuclear risk reduction measures in order to prevent them.
Maia, how do you see the situation?
Sure. Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. First of all, I want to congratulate Lina Skoyala and my colleagues here at the Geopolitics and Security Studies Center on the successful conference. And I'm grateful on behalf of the Foreign Policy Research Institute to be here in Vilnius. I think this is a really important conversation. And so far, I'm really impressed by how honest and direct everyone has been about the issues. So I'm honored to be a part of this conversation. When I thought about these very, very provocative and important questions that were sent to us panelists, I thought it would be very important to sort of take a step back and think about how history might judge us based on our actions over the recent years. So as a reminder, for context, it has been almost 3 years since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and it has been 10 years since Euromaidan in Ukraine. So we have an opportunity to really sort of take a stock, right, for perspective and see where we are. When we talk about the red lines, for that reason, I'm more concerned with the West's red lines, the red lines that we've drawn for Russia versus the red lines that Russia has drawn, and I think Julia did a great job in summarizing that. What have been our red lines? And when I say us, again, coming from an American think tank, I think about the collective West and also the United States, primarily US foreign policy. What are the red lines we have shown to Russia? especially with the war in Ukraine. I would argue that we haven't been very clear about what our red lines are. The only clear red line that I have seen is about the Article 5. Every time there is an escalation in Ukraine, NATO leaders come out and say how we are reinforcing the boundaries of NATO. Guess what does not fall within those boundary lines? It's Ukraine, it's Moldova, it's Georgia. So, one of the questions posed to us was, whose game are we playing? We have been so reactive to Russia's actions, Russia's aggression, especially under Putin's leadership, that I would have to say that we are playing Russia's game. When we fail to preempt Russia's actions, Ukraine is a good example. We knew there was this military buildup for a year leading into the full-scale invasion. When we fail to preempt, when we fail to have a clear strategy, we just show that we are playing Putin's game, we are playing Russia's game. Our actions are also showing that despite our rhetoric, we are actually ascribing to Putin's worldview, where bigger, stronger, mightier nations can bully smaller countries and start wars with them, or try to annex them and take territory. We saw this start in Georgia in 2008. It's only gotten worse. I want to mention this. Since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, people talk about, make comparisons with Georgia. Let me remind you, in August of 2008, when Russia invaded Georgia, that war lasted 5 days, right? And it has left a huge mark. Again, it will be 3 years since Russia invaded Ukraine, and it's been this ongoing full-scale war without a break. To compare the two is kind of insane. So I think it's really important to, again, take a stock of what messages have we been sending to Russia in terms of our red lines. Beyond Article 5, I have not seen much. Since Obama's, ill-fated reset politics with Russia, I have not seen a clear US policy on Russia. I think in that regard, the Europeans have been bolder and more clear with how they see Russia. The United States still does not have a clear Black Sea strategy. We really love having sort of written strategies and clearly communicated strategic documents. We don't have a clear Black Sea strategy. Not only that, one has been in the works for years, and there has been no agreement on it. So what is an actual Black Sea strategy in the absence of a clear one? It's where the lines of NATO's Article 5 fall. That's it. The rest of it falls into a gray zone. And where does Russia thrive most? In the gray zones, right? In de facto occupied territories, in breakaway territories, but also in the gray spaces where the West fails to have a clear policy and a clear stance. Before I go on for too long, let me just add one more thing. While we have failed to show Russia where the red lines are for us in Ukraine, we have been very clear with Ukraine where our red lines are when it comes to Russia. Those red lines are at Russia's borders. I think Tomas said it really beautifully that we are not prepared for a Russian defeat, for a Russian failure. We're not prepared for a Russian collapse. These are the conversations you would have heard in Washington over the last 3 years. What did we tell the Ukrainians? Do not hit targets within Russia's borders. Also, when you do hit targets within Russia's borders using your own weapons, please make sure you don't hit strategic targets and don't destabilize Russia's ability to produce, be an effective energy producer. We've made it clear that we are not prepared for a Russian economic failure or Russian energy failure. And again, this is no secret. In Washington, there are many conversations about how does this war end without the collapse of Putin's regime? How do we end the war? How can Ukraine win? And how can we make sure that Putin saves face? These are ridiculous conversations. So I think we need to own them. We need to understand. And again, I primarily direct this criticism to the United States. There's a need for a strategy. If we say that we do not ascribe to this Russian-led worldview, then we need to prove it with actions, and I have not seen that.
Thank you very much. A quick reminder to our audience that you can still ask your questions at Slido app. Just please scan the QR code and send us your questions. We'll be waiting for them. Thomas, I saw that you wanted to react.
I just wanted to expand a little bit and maybe to get into a little debate with you, Julia, about nuclear scenarios and how Westerns are perceiving those threats. Looking from how inconsistently Russians are speaking about those risks, how they could react to, let's say, the supply of some kind of new weapons to Ukraine, or how they could react when Ukrainians are using long-range rockets against Russian targets, how they are changing their responses. I would say that this flexibility also shows that they have no clear red lines at all, and they are just trying to play this kind of deterrence game against West. And the main goal for them is to prevent Western forces to get into direct conflict with Russians. So I would say that we also should evaluate this kind of genuine goals, strategic goals from Russian side. Putin wants to conquer Ukraine, military or politically, just to get over the state, and the major prevention could be the direct involvement of military forces from United States or Western Europe. So, and of course Russians are trying to increase the potential cost of this involvement, and they are over and over repeating this risk of nuclear escalation, because this is the only way they can prevent the real involvement of Western forces to defend Ukraine. And so far they are succeeding in doing that. But of course I totally agree that we should not neglect the possibility of nuclear escalation. As far as Russians have those nuclear weapons and doctrines and even some very clear implementation procedures, of course, this scenario should be treated very, very seriously. But don't you think that we are just preoccupied too much only on this, I would say, low probability scenario, and forgetting a much broader spectrum of involvement into this war by making much more stronger response to Russian advance, Russian attacks on Ukraine?
Yulia, would you like to respond?
Yeah, I really appreciate your view and that we're having a conversation. And I think I would agree that they don't have a clear strategy. I mean, what I would describe as this fog of nuclear war plays exactly into that field. They don't have like a clear strategy. It almost seems like this is a very emotional thing. Like something happens on the Western side, we're going one step into one direction, and then suddenly, I don't know, something like a new threat comes up, a new missile shows up, something else. What my concern is, and just to say that very quickly, it's interesting to have this conversation with you, because normally I'm the one, especially in the beginning after the beginning of the full-scale invasion, I was invited to media a lot, and usually there was some very right-wing person sitting there and was like, but what about nuclear war? And I was in the position to say, well, I think we shouldn't only talk about this scenario. So it wasn't a completely different conversation, but obviously you couldn't have a proper conversation with these people at all. So what my concern is, and I think this also has to do with what happens in Syria right now, that at some point the leadership really get under a lot of pressure, and they would do something very stupid, like just exploding a very small-scale nuclear weapon in some remote territory in Ukraine. I think this is a very remote scenario. It's very unlikely, but it would be very impactful. What would be NATO's response? Would there be a conventional response, as was discussed in the very beginning? Would there be some pressure to respond in a nuclear manner? I don't know. Again, I think that's very remote. But also to emphasize that I think the biggest risk is not necessarily an intentional nuclear war started by Russia, but a situation in which Russia gets very confused, the West doesn't understand what Russia wants. With the advent of new technology, we anyways have a lot of problems in the nuclear sphere when it comes to nuclear command, control, and communication structure, and that something goes out of hand. I won't say this has to limit our options when it comes to supporting Ukraine, but what would be needed at the same time would be some level of risk reduction measure. And at the same time, this is very, in the Cold War it was doable with Russia because they understood the risk, and I think they still understand the risk, because otherwise when they tested Otarashvili in Ukraine, they wouldn't have given the notification according to the ballistic missile launch notification agreement. I mean, not in a 24 hours slot, which they were supposed to do, but at least they did that. Yeah, so it's a dilemma.
Maia, let's turn the conversation a bit further from the nuclear red lines, but to the political red lines, and especially what we are seeing right now in Georgia. We have been observing similar trends for many years already in such states like Moldova, other states where Russia wanted to collude and to blur out the political sphere in those countries. How can we respond to that? How can those smaller states respond to that? Lithuania is quite lucky because we have, obviously, Article number 5. We are in the European Union, but there are some states that would like to see their own future in closer to European Union or NATO. But Russia is quite successful preventing and holding on to them. What is your thoughts?
Thank you so much. That's a great question. Yeah, I think Georgia is such an interesting case right now. So for those of you who may not know, in October, the government that's been in charge for 12 years, who is led by essentially a Russian oligarch, stole the parliamentary election. And right after that, they came out and said, we're going to halt EU accession talks at least until 2028. And what that led to is this massive uprising where people have been demonstrating 24/7 since November 28th. EU flags everywhere. People are not going home at night. This is not just a, sort of a demonstration showing dissatisfaction with the government's policies, but it's a demonstration demanding that the government resign, and we haven't seen that in a very long time in Georgia. I have to add that according to the latest polls, 80% of Georgians approve of Georgia's Euro-Atlantic future, EU membership and NATO membership, and it's in Georgia's constitution that all governments are responsible to do everything they can to work towards Georgia's EU and NATO accession. So when you are a Georgian government, you're constitutionally obligated to work with the EU leadership and NATO leadership to keep the country on a Western path. So what we are seeing in the streets of Georgia right now is a civil society, is a pro-Western society that is extremely well organized, but deeply, deeply pro-European, that demands a European future. The government that is in charge has become increasingly associated with Russia. If they remain in charge, the people see it as Russia being in charge. Now, this government, led by the Russian billionaire oligarch, has been in charge of the country for 12 years. So what we are seeing right now in Georgia is a result of absolute oligarchic state capture in Russia's favor. So I think what's very interesting is that the society and the government are completely split in their pro-European stance. The government is trying to drag Georgia back to the Russian orbit, but the society wants EU membership. What's very interesting about this society is that since Georgia's independence, 1991, it's been the joint European and American efforts that have groomed this society to be so civilized, so democratic, and so pro-European. But how can we support these people, right? Because up to this point, the West has really failed to sanction this government in its authoritarian tendencies. The United States still has not sanctioned Ivanishvili, the oligarch, right? So we are seeing a failure in deploying the leverage, the immense leverage that the West has had over this government. But now there's an interesting situation where, okay, the EU is going to halt accession talks with Georgia, and the United States has canceled the strategic partnership with Georgia. But where does that leave the people that are in the streets protesting right now, demanding a European future? The government has been deploying riot police, has been arresting people, beating people. I think we are going to see a Euromaidan-like situation in Georgia in the coming weeks. And the question is going to be, as these people look to the West for help, for assistance, what are the tools that we can offer? And we don't have a clear sense of that. So I think it's going to be a very interesting situation. But Russia is all over this. They've played the long game of penetrating Georgian politics and co-opting it. So we're seeing the very successful results of that. And the government is using very Russia-like tried and true tactics in oppressing opposition. So,
Thank you so much. We have quite a lot of questions at Slido. Tomas, could we start with you? We have interesting question. How could we utilize the red lines on either side of this war to provoke Russia to finally move to the reactive position? In other words, how I understand, how to make that Russia would react to our actions and not another way around.
Well, let's start from the very simple thing. Russia is an attacker. Russia made the first move, and of course, it's natural that Western powers are reacting. And unfortunately, this reaction decisions are still under control, as I said, with restrictions in our mindset. And even some quite good decisions regarding sanctions on Russia, restriction to sell oil or gas to European Union and something like that, they're still not enough to change this dynamic and to become an attacker on Russia. Because we still believe that we should defend. We should defend and we should sustain in our values in protecting Ukraine, but we should not attack Russia, and we should not to cross this red line, as you said, maybe the border with Russia or some deeper strikes inside Russia or something like that. As far as we are on this defensive mode, I would say we cannot change the dynamic and we cannot impose any kind of damage on Russia which is not sustainable by the Putin's regime. So far they are finding quite good measures to sustain this economic damage, even military damage and whatever. So, and it would require a very innovative way to change the tables. So I think that we are not ready to do that at all.
Very quick follow-up question. Is it possible reorganizing and having Russia on their back feet and having them to react without being with a full-on hot war with Russia? Because what Yulia was saying with the risk management and what takes the Western side to calculate a little bit more closer what Russia could do with, as their reaction.
I doubt it. I doubt it about possibilities to induce a large amount of damage to Russia in economic sense, or to say even if we are succeeding in damaging Russian economy, it could be not enough to change of a Putin regime or to retract forces from Ukraine. I believe that we are playing quite different games here. on the Western side, we are playing the soft game of sanctions, some restrictions, and so on. But we are even restricting ourselves to go further, let's say to go into a zone of hybrid warfare, which Russia is using very well. They are playing this card against us, starting from cyber operations, psychological information warfare, and just recently with many actions of sabotage in European countries. They are using all these spectrum of gray zone arsenal. But we are just restricting to quite simple responses.
Thank you. Yulia, I have one question for you. Do you discern any risk in a situation when Ukraine is invited by the allies to join NATO? Konstantin Negret asked that question, and how do you see that? Would that risk be eliminated, or how could Russia react to such a development where they precisely stated that one of the reasons they started the war was to prevent such move by Ukraine?
You mean in terms of heightening nuclear risks? Can I maybe also say quickly 2 fingers on the previous questions, because just very quickly, I think that's an interesting one. For one, I think one element that has been a bit outside of this action-reaction circle was NATO's nuclear posture, because that has not really changed. I mean, NATO has certainly bolstered its conventional deterrence, and rightly so, but they have been more or less steadfast on, they were sticking to the nuclear posture that they had prior to 2022, with all the modernizations and updates that were planned well ahead. And I think that's a signal of strength, that you differentiate between upgrades in the conventional sphere, but showing that NATO has a credible nuclear deterrence. I think one element that hasn't been mentioned, and I wouldn't say it brings us out of this action-reaction cycle, but it's certainly an important aspect, is seeing China as a lever. China certainly had some influence on Russia when it comes only to the nuclear angle, because I'm just focusing on the nuclear angle here. China is very problematic in other aspects. We've had a very interesting conversation over dinner last night, but we shouldn't forget that China is not interested in nuclear war. They are interested in a Europe that they can do trade with, so they're not interested in that. That's just one thought. On the other question, yeah, I don't have a definite answer, honestly. In effect, I wanted to ask you, after your remarks, whether you see, like, if Ukraine was in NATO, would Russia's aggressions be directed against Georgia or Moldova? I think at least in the hybrid sphere, we would definitely see something like this happening, because the space for Russia is shrinking. It would be an immense provocation. I couldn't imagine that this wouldn't have any repercussions. What that could look like, I'm absolutely not sure. I don't have a glass ball, but I think the minimum of what we would see would be an increased hybrid activity in Moldova and in Georgia. But I don't know, maybe you're an expert on these countries, so maybe you see these things differently.
Sure, thank you. And yeah, I'm very critical of China and China's interest in the region, but the one thing that has to be said is China is highly motivated to see an end to the war in Ukraine in general. They don't want this war to go on. So the last thing I'm going to recommend is Chinese-led peace talks, but I think it's just an example of there is room for creativity here. And I'm just not seeing enough appetite, enough attempts, especially from Washington, to end the war, to get as creative as possible with peace talks, even under the pretense of Chinese peace talks where China is a participant, or at least using China's leverage indirectly on Russia to bring them to the negotiating table. But in terms of if Ukraine was in NATO, would Georgia and Moldova be exposed? Absolutely, they are exposed. But what's really interesting is that at least at the moment, and at least for the last 12 years, Russia does not need to invade Georgia. They have already co-opted Georgia's political space, Georgia's economy, Russia is, the #1 trade partner with Georgia. They have direct flights. The borders are open. Russians are finding a safe haven in Georgia. What's really funny is that, to the West, it looks like, well, Georgia and Russia don't have a formal diplomatic relationship. There is no Russian embassy. Guess what? There's visa-free regime between the two countries. There are direct flights to Moscow, right? So in practice, Georgia is also serving as Russia's laundromat. So what's the need to invade Georgia? But if there are signs that Georgia is going in Moldova's direction, which again, Moldova has been showing a great deal of promise in its, democratization and EU accession, then yes, the immediate slap on the wrist is dialing up the heat in the Russian-occupied territories. So yes, absolutely, I think Georgia and Moldova, Georgian people and Moldova, are rightfully very concerned about Russian threats, hybrid and physical. And yes, for me, it's very difficult to imagine Ukraine's NATO accession without at least Moldova. I think Georgia is in a very precarious situation, but I think Moldova has done all of its homework and it's very deserving of a place in the European family, with Transnistria being a huge problem to solve, obviously.
It's been a very interesting conversation, but our time is up. Thank you so much, and please join me in a big round of applause for our speakers.